We welcome you inside the Light Opera Guild here in Charleston, and it is our pleasure to be bringing you a WVSSAC Town Hall. What happened and what is next? Along with Kenny Bass and our great crew, I'm Mark Martin, delighted to be with you. And Kenny, great to be with you for a second evening in a row.
We did a parade, and now we're doing, I think, a town hall that covers pretty important issues that a lot of people have been concerned about in West Virginia, not just through the previous few weeks of the playoffs and the championships, but also in general, how the school situation has been going in West Virginia over the past couple of years.
Yeah, the West Virginia Secondary School Activities Commission, the governing board for West Virginia High School athletics, and down through the years, they've done a terrific job. And of course, along the way, there are hiccups that happen, and they have to take care of matters. And obviously, we will discuss some of those here tonight. And we have an outstanding panel joining us here tonight. First off, Mr. Rusty Webb from the Webb Law Center is joining us here to our far left there, and we have Delegate Mike Pushkin from Kanawha County. Great to have him on board. Also with us tonight is Mr. Paul Saluja from the Saluja Law Offices. Also joining us tonight is Mr. David Price, the Executive Director of the West Virginia Secondary School Activities Commission, and next to him is Mr. Bryce Casto, former outstanding coach and athletic director of West Virginia high schools here in our Mountain States. We got a great panel here, Kenny.
We do, and thank you guys for coming. I know it's the holiday season. It's very busy. Really appreciate you spending some time with us to talk about something we think is pretty important.
Yeah, no doubt about it, Kenny. And obviously, let's talk about some of the issues that took place here earlier in the season, and one of the reasons why we're here tonight.
Obviously, the most recent and maybe the most top of mind for everyone, the delay of the West Virginia high school football playoffs, and let's not forget Class A of the volleyball playoffs as well. Whenever things get into the court systems, things can get a little murky. But we have a timeline for you of what exactly happened here on the eve of the beginning of the playoffs, which forced the longest football season in high school West Virginia history. And we didn't even add an extra round or plan on having a bye week. So here's a look at what happened as the playoffs were just getting ready to underway, a timeline of the events that finally got us to a state championship game.
Less than a week before the first round of play, a Wood County Circuit Court judge granted an injunction to use the playoff rating system which was in place before the WVSSAC reclassified all the teams in the state from Quad A to Single A. In the following days, various other lawsuits were filed in several different counties. In the wake of conflicting rulings, the WVSSAC postponed the November 15th start date for the postseason. On November 19th, the High Court vacated the lower court injunctions, and the football playoffs finally got underway a week late on November 22nd. Culminating with the championships played December 14th and 15th, making this the longest high school football season in state history. Meanwhile, the state volleyball tournament was also impacted by several counties filing for relief. Like in football, playoff seeding was the question. The Supreme Court once again sided with the WVSSAC, ruling that the organization had the authority to reclassify under the West Virginia Code of State Rules. The court said the Board of Review was the place for these types of disputes and that the Circuit Court exceeded its authority. The Supreme Court also noted that it has repeatedly held that the manner in which the WVSSAC applies its rules is not subject to judicial review.
So while it did take an extra week, it was obviously worth it to the teams which participated. We will talk about the experience they had in Charleston and find out about the move from Wheeling back to the capital city after a long, long time in the Northern Panhandle. But there was that delay, and it did cause quite a bit of consternation throughout the state.
Okay, when you think about it, the West Virginia high school athletic scene has been around for a long, long time. In 1914, the West Virginia State High School Basketball Tournament sort of started this organization. It was the old West Virginia Athletic Union, and it is now known as the WVSSAC.
Based in Parkersburg, the administrative board of the WVSSAC oversees 13 different sports for boys and girls in the state, in addition to band and robotics events. The SSAC is part of the National Federation for High School Sports Organizations. Change has been abundant through the years for the SSAC, including the most recent West Virginia High School Football Championships.
It changes every year, it seems, and this year there was even more change that's taken place, going from 3 classes to 4, and so we're excited about it, giving schools that maybe not have been here for a long time or have never been here the opportunity in a lot of different sports.
David Price is the latest in a long line of those to serve as executive director for the SSAC. Now in his second full academic year, Price and his staff are in charge of the day-to-day operations for West Virginia high school sports, part of which includes running championship tournaments and meets, as well as enforcing rules set by the SSAC's member principals. The principals make up the Board of Control, which is the legislative board for the SSAC. The Board of Directors is a 10-member panel made up of principals, athletic directors, state board members, and superintendents. The Board of Review is appointed by the State Board of Education and is part of an appeals process. Championship sites are normally done on 4-year cycles. This year, championship football returned to Charleston.
We reviewed them, visited all the sites. Charleston really had a great plan. Wheeling has done a great job over the years, actually set the bar high. Charleston had a great plan and added some different features to it, and the board decided it was time to make a change.
Price has been involved with interscholastic, academic, and athletics as a one-time athlete, teacher coach, principal, superintendent, and now as the SSAC's executive director. He understands the importance of what athletics mean to schools and the areas in which they reside.
A very exciting time for communities. I know that back in the day we traveled to play, and it was the whole community came. So we know that it means a lot for communities and schools to be a part of this.
Price says the mission of the SSAC is to be fair to all. And while being the champion is the ultimate goal, there are many other positive life learning moments to be treasured by the athletes, coaches, fans, and certainly the all-important officials. And at the end of a game, a tournament, a match, and a meet, there will be a winner and one who endures defeat. It's important that those involved remember the old motto, whether win or lose, be a good sport.
Well, down through the years, they have been overseeing a lot of great events here in the state of West Virginia. And again, we got some things we want to talk about here tonight, and certainly applaud these folks as well.
And ask some important questions, not only about sports and championships and tournaments, but also about the school system itself. And with the transfer rules coming in, kind of piggybacking along the Hope scholarships, which have exploded across West Virginia, where does that leave community schools, and where does that leave athletics, and what does our future look like in a state where we have declining population? And we have just a crew to talk with us about that. We're going to start with the executive director of the West Virginia Secondary School Activities Commission. Thanks for coming. I know that sometimes you are a punching bag, and I wanted to assure you that we try to be as fair as possible. Obviously, some people are very pleased with the work that your organization does, and some people have some questions about it. But if you can kind of go through how we got to where we were, we looked at the timeline. But you just didn't make these changes in the bonus point system and the classifications on a whim. You were directed to do these things by superiors higher up on the chain. So many people may not know that. That may be the unknown hand that guides a very visible organization, which you guys are. Can you kind of walk us through the situation and how we got to where we were?
Well, thank you, Kenny. First of all, thank you all for having this and giving us the opportunity to be here and speak to this. In July of 23, took over the role as executive director, and we inherited the reclassification to roll it out for the following year, as well as the transfer rule, as you indicated there just a minute ago. So both of those changes were taking place at the same time. There was a pilot for the reclassification that took place over a 4-year period for basketball in West Virginia, and the principals, Board of Control, determined that it was successful and had very successful results in Charleston with 4 classes, and they determined they wanted to expand that to other sports, football, volleyball, baseball, softball, and cheer. So once that was voted on, the reclassification, they made some adjustments to the formula as well, where there were 4 factors moving from enrollment only to 4 factors, which included socioeconomics of the area in the school, a location factor, whether it was how close it was to a city of 10,000, and the original formula indicated how close you were to the county seat.
Ken, let me stop you real quick. Those, except for how close you were to the county seat, those other two seem like subjective types of things. Obviously, the numbers for socioeconomic are what they are, but somebody's going to judge where that puts you. So why were those included?
Well, they felt like that in some cases that the socioeconomics students may have more opportunities outside of interscholastic sports, creating better teams, better players. So they looked at that for that factor. Those numbers actually were taken from the direct certification list and from the state of West Virginia, free and reduced lunch poverty, and those numbers. Location number was taken from, I think it was the census, well, the census from the location, but also from the location of how far you were from the city of 10,000 and then the county seat. As they moved forward, they determined they would remove the county seat factor, and it went to 3 factors now. And they had to determine the percentages of what they would put to each factor. For example, the Competitive Balance Committee, which are the ones who actually structured this, determined what recommendations they wanted to make to the board of directors about this, determined that 80% of that would be based on enrollment, 10% on location, 10% on socioeconomic in the change. So when those factors were put together, it came up with a total score, and then those lines were drawn and determined by the board of directors of what they wanted to do. We made some recommendations to them, and then they decided there was some other things that they wanted to look at. They did, and those were how those lines were drawn.
That brings us to the end of the regular season. We're not getting ready for the playoffs, and some schools apparently were not pleased with the way the new bonus points were being awarded, I'm guessing, and that generated some lawsuits which would have changed the playoff seedings and changed the teams in and out. So what was the reaction of the SSAC when you heard this was coming and then saw actually these court actions taking place?
Well, actually, with bonus points, it was actually how the rating system worked.
Right, exactly. Where you're placed and whether you get in or not.
Right.
Yeah.
And at the last day of the regular season, we were hit with an injunction in Wood County, and
and what did they want to do?
They wanted to go back to the rating points prior to a board of review ruling of reclassing 11 schools and then adding 11 more to that who were affected at the same time. Well, what happened was it moved several schools out of Quad A to Triple A, which is, and Bryce Casto can speak to this. He is one who did the ratings and took care of that for us. But at the same time, this isn't new to West Virginia because schools change classifications in a reclassification year, and you may be under contract with them, and whatever classification they move to, that's what their ratings points will be and always has been. In this case, when they moved down a class, that happened. Now, keep in mind, in the rules, you have to place 6 schools in your classification or more to qualify for the playoffs. We waived that rule this year because we knew there would be changes in the classification, and we didn't want anybody to be penalized for that. So those changes were made this year, and we waived that rule. But at the end, those schools being moved down to AAA weren't worth as many bonus points, if you will, and it did affect their seeding. Not them making the playoffs, but their seeding and positioning in the playoffs.
But there were some teams that would have been knocked out, and other teams entered in if you went back to the original seeding.
It's changed.
Bonus points.
I think there were 3 or 4 teams.
Yeah, 4 teams. 2 out, 2 would have been in.
Right.
And that brings lawyers into it. Paul Saluja, thank you for joining us again. You were a part of the lawsuits that were filed against the SSAC. From your client's standpoint, why did they feel compelled to file these lawsuits? Was it simply on the issue of fairness and they felt like they'd been dealt a tough hand?
Yes, and first of all, thank you for having me on this panel. Appreciate being here. The timeline was a little bit different. I represented a few of the counties on volleyball, for the girls' volleyball, and they sought a waiver, which is permissible under the WVSSAC regulations. That waiver process, they filed the appeal for the reclassification. They went through the process, and at the conclusion in August, when, as Mr. Price indicated, there was 11 schools that were reclassified and then remanded back. That remand was never heard, and as a result, they had no choice but to file for injunctive relief. And that's what they did in both Pleasant County and in College.
We went through, though, before the show started, a litany of counties which sued, and you were kind enough to list them off. There were several. So it grew just from those two in volleyball. Obviously, the ball started rolling with football. And where was the first one, Mr. Price? The first football lawsuit?
It was Wood County.
Yeah, Wood County, in your backyard. So at least it was close. So Wood County, these other schools have sued. Rusty, as a practicing attorney for years and a former member of the House of Delegates, you've seen many lawsuits over the years against the SSAC, sometimes about eligibility, sometimes about transferring, sometimes et cetera, whenever somebody gets a B under their bonnet or they feel like they've been mistreated. What was your take on what was going on this year?
Well, I've reviewed a number of Supreme Court decisions, and the Supreme Court has been very consistent with once it gets to them, and the Supreme Court understands that local circuit courts are going to find in favor of local teams. I mean, that's the way it is. But once it gets to them, the Supreme Court has been very consistent, and basically what they did in all these cases is say, you have the WVSSAC, you're a member of that group, you're a voluntary member of that group. If you want to change the rules, but we're not going to look over the shoulders of the WVSSAC and tell them they did something right or wrong, whether it was due process or whether it was fairness or whether it was equity. And that's why you saw why the orders from the Supreme Court were very short, because they didn't have to go into a lot of law or facts. They basically said, this is your group, you got to stick with the group. You don't like the group, change the group. And that's been my experience in reviewing those cases. I haven't been involved in one. I think you know that.
Yeah.
Not directly.
Well, you've opened the Pandora's box that I'm going to jump into a little bit later in this town hall. And you just made a very cogent point that covers exactly some things we want to talk about. Okay. Mark, I know you have a question for Bryce.
Well, we touched upon it earlier that, the state football championship's coming back here to the capital city for the first time since 1993. They shifted to Wheeling in 1994. Bryce Casto winning the first AAA state championship there at Wheeling.
We remember.
I remember. He remembers it well back in 1994. Of course, Bryce had a wonderful career as the head football coach at South Charleston High School, then moved into college administration at West Virginia State University, then back into the high school classrooms and the high school football fields as well. And Bryce, for you retire from the athletic director at South Charleston, where you had so much success and so many wonderful memories. And, I know Mr. Price felt you needed something to do. The SSAC felt you needed something to do, keep you busy. So you took over handling the ratings. Just talk about, what all goes into that, and obviously adding that new class this season.
Yeah, it's a very complex process in that we have to go and first all member schools input their schedules. Then we go and identify any out-of-state opponent and the opponents of the opponents. So we have to go and get those full schedules, classify all those schools with criteria that's listed in our playoff manual, put that in a database, and essentially track it week to week. We generally do about 125 games a week that we follow, both in-state and out-of-state. And again, we have a wonderful, magnificent database that does the calculations where I don't have to get into higher mathematics each week. Although it did change a little bit the last week of the season with the injunction. We got about a 6 or 7 hour bonus plan that we didn't see coming.
Yeah, and when you think about the data, and I know the great late Bill Hanlon, I believe, sort of implemented this rating system that other states have marveled at down through the years. But you go back, I believe it was 1972. Up until that point, only 2 teams in each class made the playoffs. So there was just a state championship game. So then they shifted it to 4. 1978, they shifted it to 8. And then in 1991, they got it up to the present number of 16. So a lot more schools are involved than ever before.
Have you guys come up with a catchy new nickname yet? Super 6 is gone.
High school football championship?
No, I mean catchy.
I don't know
Is the marketing department working on that? We got to think Super 6 was awesome.
I was asked about that, and I said, what do we call every other state tournament?
Elite 8.
What do we call every other state tournament?
Well, okay, I get it. But Super 6, yeah. Okay, I'm sorry. Carry on.
Anyway, but we were just, thinking about, and then all the other sports, and for many years, just baseball, for an example, they only had one state champion of all classes. So as the years have gone on, we may have lost schools, but we have had the opportunity to give more schools a chance to compete, in state championship events.
Football gets talked about a lot, but how does the 4-class system affect every other sport in West Virginia? Not all can exist with a 16-team Class A. It just won't work in some cases, it doesn't seem like. Is that what you have found, and how do you fix that?
Well, there's no question about it. And, again, we determined that the number of schools that offer those sports changes classes. So we have some sports that are a 2-class sport. We have some sports that are a 3-class sport. And then, of course, we have the 4-class sport of the 7 sports we offer right there. So, for example, swim, it's a 1-class sport. Wrestling's a 2-class sport because the number of schools that offer. And there's a percentage in the Board of Directors manual of how to set those up, of how many schools have to have that, the sport to be able to offer and move up to a 3-class, 4-class. So, but back to your question about 16 teams, for example, in football, I know we had a 16-team class in football. That wouldn't work for basketball, baseball, softball in a regional structure because there just aren't enough teams to have regional play at that point. So you have to come up with how many teams is that going to be, and you go back to your formula or whatever classification process you plan on using, use that, and then come up with a way of how you're going to make those cut lines that isn't arbitrary and make sure that it goes through, and then you have those classifications there. But when it comes to competitive balance in the tournament structure, you do have to have a certain number to be able to have that regional play.
Delegate Mike Bush, and we'll get to you in a second, and you have a big role to play here coming up in this part of our discussion as we move out of the court system and the classifications and the bonus points and start talking about transferring in West Virginia. But before we do that, real quick, 2 things. How did it go in Charleston this year? And what do you see happening next season? Have the waters calmed?
Well, first, question number 1, how did it go in Charleston? We had a great weekend.
And he can take some credit too.
We had a great championship weekend. Bryce was a part of the committee and one of the co-directors of the football championships. And we had great weather. It was a little chilly, but that's okay. That's good football weather in December.
Right? Yeah,
we'll take it. It wasn't wet, blue skies, clear skies at night, great crowds. Communities turned out to support their schools. And there were a lot of local people came in. It was a great championship weekend. As you know, we had the cheerleading championships going on Saturday at the Civic Center with great crowds.
How was the attendance?
Attendance was great. We're working to get all of that data compiled to get our final numbers and everything. But I know looking at the football, just our preliminary data says the numbers were up really well compared to what it's been the last 5 or 6 years.
Bryce, your experience?
It was awful. A lot of planning went into it. Tim Brady with the Convention and Visitors Bureau was outstanding. Mike Arbogast led our local committee. Jim Hamrick was another one of the directors.
I know all these guys.
It just was a good group. A lot of seasoned veterans in terms of being around these type of events, and we wanted to keep the student athlete first, and I felt we accomplished that. Of course, as we started really last February. I think it will only continue to get better. We'll learn, we'll debrief here, I'm sure, right after the first of the year. We've learned a couple of things, and it will only continue to get better. But I thought it was an outstanding weekend of football.
Yeah, we definitely want to salute Kanawha Schools, University of Charleston, because the venue is a showplace.
Does anybody but me call it Lathy Field anymore?
Yeah, University of Charleston Stadium.
I still refer to it as Lathy.
And on the video board it says Lathy.
All right, well, I'm all right with that.
Beautiful venue.
It is. There's not an inch of that place that wasn't revitalized. And you'll hear of potential elevator to the press box next season.
Well, I'd like that a lot.
It is Joe Varney at Lathy Field, and then Dr. Paula Potter, who oversaw all the funds coming in. Good stuff.
Thank you. Is that in your region, in your district?
Oh, yeah. I couldn't be happier.
Yeah.
Back
And talk about what it meant for having that there.
I represent the 54th district, which is home to Laidley Field. That's right, called Laidley Field, and most of the hotels in the area, I'd say, are in my district as well. So we couldn't be happier to have it back. It's a shame that the first part of the contest was in the courts and not on the field. But there's a whole lot of issues to play into that. Look forward to talking about that here in a few.
Delegate Pushkin, did you want to say something?
Yeah, just one more thing about this weekend. We kicked off with our academic awards banquet, saluting our student athletes for their team GPAs, individual GPAs, and we actually had about 250 student athletes and their families there to recognize them at the Marriott for a banquet, and it went great. And I didn't want to not be able to mention that because I don't think we recognize our student athletes and their accomplishments in the classroom enough. And man, what a day.
Was that up or down or about what you've been doing?
It's about what we have every year. So it was great to be able to do that. And just Dr. Paula Potter, as you stated,
right.
She was in charge of that. And what an outstanding evening, great evening. And for me, being able to get back to kids and be around them, it was just absolutely outstanding.
Well done.
And what an impressive group of young. My goodness, our future's in good hands.
Well, I certainly hope so, because I'm much closer to the end than the beginning.
Me too.
Delegate Pushkin, thank you again for coming. You're on the Education Committee, so not only talking about playoffs and classifications and bonus points, the Hope Scholarship, and along with it, the transfer rule, which was added to that bill and passed, has literally changed the landscape, not just for sports in West Virginia, but for education in West Virginia. So can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing with the Hope Scholarship? I know from numbers that I've seen that the request for money from the Treasury, from the State Department of Education on the Hope Scholarship is going to go up from X million to X million this year. Yeah. Many more families are going to be taking advantage of it. So whatever we're seeing now, we're only going to be seeing more of it in the future. Can you kind of give me your take on it?
I think it's interesting that in order to get the transfer rule passed, they tacked it onto another bill.
Explain that.
Well, it was, that was that transfer bill. There was more debate on that bill. I believe it was on a Friday night late in the session, and we went late debating that bill. And I believe the bill was in trouble, and it wound up coming, I think it came back from the Senate, and correct me if I'm wrong, attached to the Hope Scholarship bill, which of course had a lot of support in the majority party. And then I believe that's how they got it passed. In my opinion, both issues, whether it's the vouchers, which you could call the Hope Scholarship, or the transfer rule, has really exacerbated many of the problems we're seeing due to population loss. And that's the issue that we're not talking about. And it was disappointing to me. I know people are passionate about sports. I'm passionate about sports. It brings people together. It creates community. But the most passionate debate we had was about high school sports and not about what are we going to do to stem population loss, because that's what's leading this whole issue. I'm more concerned about schools closing. That is devastating to communities, and we're seeing that across the state.
But it's also a case
it's going to spread over into sports because we're losing neighborhood schools across this state.
But closing schools is also a case of dollars and cents. There's a formula. You lose enough students, you can't keep them open. It's difficult.
The Hope Scholarship has not helped that problem. It is exacerbated.
And how is that? Explain why.
Population loss also is what's led to that. And every issue that we take up at the legislature should be talked about through the prism of, does this make people want to live here? Does this make young people want to stay here?
But why hasn't the Hope Scholarship helped? Exactly why? Where does that money go?
Well, it goes out of the school system.
Follows the student.
It follows the student. Yes. Now, whether that's right or wrong, there's good points on both of that, but that's a fact. It's taking money out of our public schools.
Rusty, I know when you were in the legislature, education, as it is every year, was always a big topic. When you look at the Hope Scholarship, which some people argue for school choice, they argue for parents to have more control, even homeschooling if you want to do it, that's been a fairly conservative, moderate to conservative issue. What do you see happening in West Virginia? We've had a spate of school closing hearings. We've had lopsided scores due to at least being attributed to mass transfers from schools, from one school to another. Good, bad, indifferent? Should people have the choice?
Well, I'm so old that I was around when the Hope Scholarship was created for colleges, right? So I was there when Governor Wise gave out the first college Hope Scholarships back in the late 90s, early 2000s. My role here this evening was going to be more legal than political, but
you got a little political still in you.
Put me on the spot. I'm going to tell you that the monies, which I think is around $27 million, is a fraction of the total budget. Now, you're telling me it's going up. I don't know where it's going up. I couldn't speculate on that, but giving students an opportunity to get out of failing schools and take their money into a private setting, it doesn't bother me at all. I mean, again, didn't come here for the political
Right.
side of it, but yeah, I don't have a problem with the transfer rule. I have a big problem with.
And what's the differentiation between the two? Differentiation.
Well, I mean, I'm talking about if you can change schools at your whim, just like you can in the transfer portal in college. And it just happened to Marshall University to the point where we can't even field a team at a bowl game now. So I don't like that, and I think if the transfer rules are allowed to stay in place with such liberal ability to go, I think that's going to eventually happen to high school teams as well. Students will transfer out seeking the next, the trophy or the next coach or the next, big school and or facilities, and it's going to leave that school with fewer students. And like the executive director said, you may have to reclassify them because everybody transferred out into the big schools. So I'm not a big fan of the transfer rule at all. But I'm old school. I'm old school. I'm not a big fan of the portal. I'm not a big fan of NIL. I'm not a big fan of any of the new modern stuff.
Well,
It takes away from amateurism.
I know you're here for the legal side of it, which what you talked about earlier is going to be the topic of our third point of discussion. But I do appreciate your expertise. Politically served for a long time, and I appreciate your viewpoint. You had a question for Mr. Saluja.
Yeah, Mr. Saluja, obviously the money following the kids, and obviously that can create budget holes, correct?
To me?
Yeah, I mean, as well, you represent. I mean, you were in the midst of this over the playoffs, but yet we see a lot of results, lopsided results, big holes in schools, and this is a lawyer looking at it. What do you think about the situation we're in with public schools versus private, charter, and homeschooling?
And I think that's where part of the issue stems from, is that you do have this liberal transfer portal now, and as a result, each student athlete is looking for what's best for them. The concern is, though, what does it do to a team? For example, as Rusty indicated earlier, Marshall wasn't even able to field a team for the bowl game.
Absolutely.
But where does that fall on the student athlete, or does that fall on the leadership failing to have the adequate rules? I don't believe the transfer portal, for example, at the college level, should occur before all the bowl games are completed.
Absolutely.
And I don't believe a college coach should be able to switch then before all the bowl games are complete. But at the high school level, I'm not so sure that we can't somehow put together a rule that could accommodate and balance that out. For example, in the educational arena, students can transfer if honors classes are not available or something that's academically not available to them. They're permitted to transfer schools. And we need to somehow have it so that not only do you balance the academics, but also have the athletics with it as well. Earlier, before we even got on with the mic'd up and everything, we were having a discussion here. And one of the things we discussed was, academics teaches quite a bit. But there is a role with athletics. It teaches teamwork better than academics does.
Also brings communities together.
Absolutely. I mean, you think about most of the country songs. They talk about Friday Night Lights.
That's right.
That's something all these communities come together to watch their school do it. Here in West Virginia, it's probably even more important because we don't have any professional sports. So we don't have an NFL team that we all follow or an NBA team. What we have is our high school athletics. We do have, WVU and Marshall that people tend to follow. But high school is where it's at. And so we need to somehow balance that transfer rule so that it can be similar in nature to the academics.
Well, it's long said, that athletics, band, any extracurricular activity, it is an extension of the classroom. And Delegate Pushkin, just maybe the final word here on this topic.
And reacting to some of what Rusty said, two different viewpoints, but he made some great points about the pros of it, and you've talked about the cons of it possibly.
I think you really can't separate the issues, whether it's the transfer rule from vouchers, which is called the Hope Scholarship, and another issue we haven't brought up is what they call the Tebow rule, which says that a student can be homeschooled or in a private school and then play sports, go play football for whichever school they want to play for.
And the school they play football for does not get that money.
And my
it stays
concern
with
first
us,
and
right?
foremost is that are our children getting educated? And I think they will agree with the biggest recipient of this Hope Scholarship, these vouchers, are for families that are taking their children out and putting them in front of a computer screen, which they call virtual charters. I would like for you to look up the test scores for some of these virtual charters.
How are they?
Children across the state going to these virtual charters, which means sitting in front of a computer screen, and their test scores are abysmal.
Isn't that what we did?
Not learning.
Isn't that what we did in COVID? And it didn't work?
And there's a report that has not been released. I don't know if it will ever be released from the Legislative Auditor's Office, which unfortunately no longer exists as we know it. But they did a report on learning loss during COVID, and I'd get you a copy of it. It is, it's horrible. But the learning loss during COVID. And we're saying that's a good idea to just put a child in front of a computer screen and expect them to learn? They should be in a classroom.
The SSAC, I'll let you guys chime in on this. He mentioned the TBO rule. If you go into virtual school, or if you go to a parochial school or a private school which doesn't have that sport that you want to play, you could then play in the school in which district you live in, but that school gets no money. That the money stays with the student, with the parochial school, or the charter school, or whatever. So how does that impact the high school where you're playing football and it takes uniforms, it takes work, or any sport, it all takes equipment and there's all travel costs, et cetera, et cetera.
And some of the concerns we've heard, it could displace a student who goes to that school from their team or position, from coming to another
starting quarterback come in, and the guy who was the quarterback, he gets to the bench, and the homeschool guy gets the starting quarterback job.
And I find it interesting as well that during that time when that rule was made, or that law was put into effect, that some of the private schools did not want that because they were afraid they would lose enrollment because those players would go back to the school, form relationships with their teammates, and want to transfer back to the public school. So they were afraid they would lose enrollment as well. So they weren't for that as much as people would think, but it still went into effect.
I've heard anecdotally, and I don't care if it's a question coming up, that South Charleston lost some transfers during football season. And right after football season, a few folks came back because they wanted to graduate from South Charleston. Have you heard the same thing?
A few. Most left and stayed going.
Right, but
the first year, the
few prodigal sons and daughters came back.
We lost a significant amount, and we lost our juniors and seniors, and we ended up playing the next season we started 18 freshmen. That's a tough gig on Friday night for a football coach against the schedule that South Charleston High School plays.
Right.
Bryce, you started as a young coach there in the mid-'80s, and of course gradually moved on into the collegiate scene and then back to the high school scene. But just from an expense standpoint, I don't think people have any idea, do they?
No, just what it costs to outfit one football player with uniform. Well, I know the last year I was at South Charleston for 2 sets of Nike uniforms. We spent nearly $25,000 just for uniforms. It doesn't.
How'd they look?
They're beautiful. As they should have been.
That's a lot of popcorn, Bryce.
Yeah,
That's
That's a lot of hot dogs.
It doesn't include a helmet or a shoulder pad or any other protective gear. And then you talk about officiating costs. I mean, it's. I've had fans ask, why do we have to charge admission? Well, we have to pay for those things.
Right. I want to go to the third part of our discussion. Thank you for that. I think that was helpful. Everybody talking about the transfer rule in relation to sports and also public schools. But let's go to the last point that Rusty brought up and touched upon. That I know this is why you're here, the legal part, and it was a great point. The Supreme Court has, even in this ruling, which I cribbed in the story that we saw, that said we have repeatedly ruled, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, private organization, private rules. So I'm going to ask everybody along the line here, maybe not, unless Mike, you can dive into it if you want to, or you can stay away from it. But Rusty, if you keep seeing that result, then why doesn't something change where these people aren't bringing lawsuits? And Paul, since you brought a lawsuit, I certainly want to hear what you have to say about this. But you go give me an overview first, Rusty. Does the Supreme Court want to deal with this stuff even?
No, they don't. But you have to put yourself in the position of these fans and football coaches and the players that are affected by it, right? So whatever county you live in, if you think that your team is not going to get the fair opportunity to play in postseason play, like Paul says, you got to file the injunction. And so is your circuit judge in county going to rule against the county football team or basketball or volleyball team? The answer is no, they're probably not. So that's why you had this consolidation of all these cases at once where they could tell everyone, we've told you this a number of times.
They keep saying it.
We're going to tell you again, no matter what you bring up here, at least so far, unless you raise a constitutional issue that we need to handle or some real serious violation of due process, you got to follow your private rules. You're a private club, you make your private rules, and if you don't like your private rules, change your private rules, but we're not going to deal with it.
So, in spite of what they're saying, are those lawsuits going to keep coming?
Yeah, they'll keep coming. Sure they will.
Mike, your thoughts?
Well, I can understand why an elected circuit court judge is always going to rule with their...
All races are local?
Yeah, they're always going to rule with their people. They're local people who get incredibly
You work hard in your district, right?
Incredibly passionate about high school sports and especially football. So I can see why the Supreme Court also would want to punt on this, and I will too.
Paul, you were in the midst of the arena this time, and you guys aren't even finished yet. I know there's still some court business and still to do. So we won't touch upon that. We'll let the courts handle that. But you know better than I do the history of the Supreme Court rulings in West Virginia on SSAC cases. Is it a matter of just taking care of your clients and helping them try to reach a solution they want? Or is there some aspect of, well, I kind of know how this is going to go, so I'm going to tilt at a few windmills here and take a shot and see what happens?
Well, I think the SSAC has their own appeal process. They do have a process that's listed in the regulations. And if you go through that process and it's not completed, sometimes you have no choice but to seek judicial intervention. And I think that's what's happened recently. I mean, obviously, you're well aware that I've represented some. Those documents are public. They're part of the public record.
I have them.
But
I'm
the
right
reality
here.
is, I can only say that, we respect the Supreme Court's decision, but we also feel that the SSAC, as you can see through the documents, didn't actually go through all their regulatory process. Mm-hmm. So, as such, I thought judicial intervention was necessary.
Mm-hmm. David, your thoughts?
You get sued a lot, Dave.
Obviously, we differ in opinion on that.
You do get sued a lot, though.
Going through the process, I think that it's there will be more evidence, obviously, that would show that we did or the board did. But
don't litigate it here. I know you got.
At the same time, this past year we were there a lot, and we had a lot of competing orders. And as the executive director, I can't pick and choose which order I'm going to follow because I'll be held in contempt that way. So that's the reason we ended up in front of the Supreme Court.
And that's why you did the full stop, right?
Exactly. And, fortunately, the Supreme Court acted upon the volleyball and the football in a timely fashion to make sure we could get it going as soon as possible. Even though we had to put the brakes on for just a little bit, we were still able to do it successfully for both, and very proud of how we were able to pull that off. Unfortunately, for the kids, and the brakes had to be put on, and it stopped a little bit of momentum for that and the excitement, but it was actually quick enough to where we could build it back.
Mm-hmm. And Bryce, obviously you spend a lot of time though as a coach in postseason play, so you know how hungry you are and how hungry these teams are to get there and try the ultimate goal, as I said in my piece, is to win a championship.
It's palpable when you talk with your student athletes. They're there to compete, and any delay was difficult. I talked to a couple of playoff participants this year during the delay, and would ask for some advice as to what you would do to try to make their practices lively. And I told them to take a look at it like it was a bowl practice and opportunity for repetition. You don't know your opponent yet, so you're looking at reps, and each week, and that's one of the big advantages of having a bowl team in collegiate athletics. And in playoff participation, you get extra weeks of practice. I think more repetitions.
I think Bridgeport's coach even said, we're going to work on things we would never work on. We're going to make our team better. And they did pretty well in the championship game.
We always talked about Martinsburg, and I figured it up one time. If you were a freshman at Martinsburg and you played in 4 straight state championships, you played 16 extra games in your high high school football career.
Another season.
That's almost 2 more seasons. I have one thing I'll just ask
Sure.
David real quick. You know, we're talking about, you know, rules and just implementing, you know, fairness and all that. And I know something that you guys desperately need, David, in all sports, talk about it a lot, officials.
You know, the average age of officials in West Virginia is 58 years old.
Wow.
And they're actually leaving more than we're getting. We were able to work with the West Virginia Department of Education to put the program in our high schools, and as part of the physical education program, to start getting people certified and getting our student athletes certified so that they can officiate middle school and youth leagues, and at the same time, upon graduation, start entering into JV and varsity levels. So we're trying to get that started, but we do need officials, because without them, guess what happens?
Chaos.
Chaos.
No games, right?
We don't have games.
Self-called games. I do want to ask you, not only as a coach and athletic director, now you're on the committee. So now you're on the other side, you've been awarded it, you've worked hard for it. Now you have to wait a week. And you got to change schedules, you got to change everything. How was that?
It was entertaining, I will tell you that.
I'll bet it wasn't.
We had to go
I'll bet it wasn't entertaining.
We had to assure the venue and then availability of all other folks, so essentially push things back. And we actually had, I know Tim Brady actually mentioned with the cheerleading competition in town, there was some competition for hotel rooms.
Well, and volleyball had to go to a different venue.
Absolutely.
Went down to West Virginia State, right?
You did a great job, by the way.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Had to be
at a moment's notice.
Hey, guys, thank you so much. We didn't solve anything here, and these questions are going to remain, but I think with the expertise of this panel, explaining it much better than any reporter can, that I can, that this is valuable, and maybe people can move forward with at least an educated mindset about it's not just keeping kids out of the playoffs, and it's not just ruining a playoff system, and it's not just creating legislation to limit choice and all these things, that there's a big, big picture with a lot of moving parts, and you have to try to figure out how to serve as many people as the best you can. So thank you for coming. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, and I think, too, you've got 5 gentlemen here that when it's all said and done, you know, number one, they care about kids.
Oh, absolutely.
And that is first and foremost. So thank you again, Rusty and Mike and Paul, and certainly David and Bryce. Great being with you guys tonight. Here.
Appreciate it. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Here inside live, the Light Opera Guild, we appreciate all of you being here for the WVSSAC Town Hall. What happened? What's next? For Kenny Bass, I'm Mark Martin. Thank you for joining us.